Yamadai, Ngaya Gila Michael Anderson, Ngaya Boygerul Gamaroi, Ngaya Ngamunga Yualiai, Gabudul Ngaya Gano Ngana Terry. I've just simply said to you, it's nice to be here, and hi to all you, and that my mother is of the Yualiai people, and my father is the Gamaroi people, and it's nice to be on Kanu land, and I thank you for allowing me to be here. Just in saying that in my own language is a bit of a challenge, because I'm one of the lucky ones who came through the ages of the, what do they call it, fringe dwellers after the 1940s, when they started moving all our mob off the properties and lands in New South Wales and made it illegal for Aboriginal people to be on their own lands. And so the pastoralists had to move us off, and we ended up living on the fringes of these towns as in southwest Queensland. Having grown up, I grew up in two worlds, really. One, because I grew up with a family that maintained our traditional heritage, our language, and I lived in the bush with my grandmother and grandfather until I was old enough to go to the white man's school. When I got into the white man's high school, I had a great auntie who was the boss law woman for my mob. And this old woman, she used to walk to school with me, and she always said to me, "Don't you muck up now, mate, eh? You look after them fellas. I know you want to fight every white fella in the school all the time and smash them, but that's not the right thing to do." And she said, "Just make one promise to me." She said, "I want you to learn how to, that white man's word. And I want you to learn how to lift that white man's word up and see what's underneath it." Because that's what she said education was about. You know, I never really understood what she was saying until I went and studied law at the University of New South Wales. And then, becoming a public prosecutor in the district court in criminal law in New South Wales, I realised what my great auntie said, what she's talking about. You see, that white man plays funny games with his own words, and he tricks us blackfellas up all the time. You know, we often say, you know, the white man came with the Bible in one hand and to give us spirit. And he was very clever, because while he had given us that spirit in the book, he took the land while we were reading that book and trying to understand it. And then the title transferred. That was very smart, real clever way, you know. My father says, well, you know, the only thing they gave us was the spirit in the bottle to make us happy. And that's where we've been ever since. And we've been trying to get away from that, to break it. Having studied law and then becoming involved in, being involved since I was 13-year-old as a kid, watching the old Aboriginal Progress Associations and my mum being secretary, and growing up in a very racist town, in a country town called Walgett in northwest New South Wales. You know, this, if you really wanted to know about a redneck town, that was it, and it still is. Because in town, in that town now, even on one side are the Uncle Toms and the white fellas, and on the other side is all the black fellas, downtown trodden workers, and dole people and drunks and druggies. There's this massive divide, and so it horrifies me. It horrifies me to think that we are still in a society where we are ruled by our class, by our gender, we're in a class war. But for us blackfellas, Aboriginal people, we still don't know where we belong in a country that we call our own. And it's unfortunate that we're in this predicament. And so, having been involved in politics, I decided that, okay, I'm going to get stuck into this stuff when I turned up in Sydney. And of course, me and 7 other blackfellas, young fellas who just come out of high school in the 1960s, we all turned up in Sydney, just coincidentally, from different parts of New South Wales, and we started a movement called the Black Power Movement. And of course, from 1970 to 1972, we rocked the foundations of this nation, and we got on the streets and we didn't give a damn who was in front of us. And today, I still don't give a damn who's in front of me, because if you're objecting to where I'm coming from, I will walk over top of you if you're weak. I am not an Australian. Let me please make that very clear. I'm Yualia Gamaroi Mardi Dane. I got nothing to do with white Australia. And I don't want to be a part of white Australia. I speak my language, I got my land, I got my law that belong to country, not the imposed white man's law. Sure, I have a driver's license, I register my motor cars, I insure my motor cars, because I don't want to give him the chance to put me in jail, because that's where he wants me. I'm not going to give him the chance to do the things that he's doing to our people. But you see, I'm going to turn this around on him. And in the years that I've had in politics in Canberra, being taught by some very clever blackfellas, you know, I was always told once we started the Black Power movement, you're no good if you're dead, and you're no good to us if you're in jail. We need you on the outside to teach us how to fight this white man. Learn his game. Understand how he fights us. Understand and learn his system so that we can undermine him. Now, fortunately, in 2015, we have a situation where even the white fellas are starting to challenge the jurisdiction of this country. I've seen high court cases where white people are challenging the validity of the sovereignty of this nation. And in one particular high court case called Jose, in the 1990s, Jose and others in the High Court went right through this massive consideration of whether Australia was a legal nation and whether it had standing in the international community. And the only thing that those judges could come up with, this is the full bench of the High Court of Australia, was that Australia was a recognised nation in the world only because it signed the Treaty of Versailles and they signed the United Nations Charter. That gives Australia its legitimacy in the international community. It does not have any other legitimacy whatsoever. None. And then you look at the high courts in a number of other cases when they deal with, okay, like for example, there's another high court case that happened in relation to the seas and submerged lands in New South Wales. It was called New South Wales versus the Commonwealth. In that court case, Chief Justice Stevens said that they were arguing about who owned the water beyond a cannon shot, because that's all New South Wales owned under English law. So who owned the waters beyond a cannon shot? A cannon shot, I understand, is about 30 yards, right, out to sea. So from there, who owns that land? Oh, that waters. As it turned out, they said, well, you know, it belonged to no one. So the High Court gave it to the Commonwealth and said they had jurisdiction over it. But what about us? And in that same court case, they said that, well, we didn't have to worry about anything in Australia other than the white and the English settlement and the law of England, because there was no one here to transfer any ownership from, to. Now, that became a problem because then they recognised they're arguing that this place was terra nullius, there was no one there, there was no leadership, so they couldn't negotiate anything. And then along came High Court and Mabo. Mabo threw that out the window. And so, wait a minute, there were people here. Now, a lot of people condemn Mabo. A lot of white lawyers say it created more questions than it gave answers. True. Very true. However, if you read that case the way a blackfellow reads it, and the way I've workshopped it in New York at the New York University Law School, there's some hidden treasures that are built within that High Court decision that every white lawyer in this country hides from. And they tell our people lies. In that court case, one of the things that they said was that the Privy Council in 1888 already decided on the continuing proprietary interest of Aboriginal lands in Canada, in a case in Canada, which applied to us as well, because of the common law nature of the Western system. They gave and they said that the Indian rights, Aboriginal rights, survived British sovereignty. Aboriginal rights survived British sovereignty. Aboriginal proprietary rights, that is, in land. Now, one thing that the courts in this country ignore are three very early cases in Australia, in the Supreme Court, as it was in New South Wales, in the 1800s. One was one in 1820, where a fellow was taken to court for killing another black fellow under his law. And this old man challenged the jurisdiction of the court for killing another man under his law. This was on the Nepean River, just west of Sydney. And in that case, he said that I'm not subject to you because I'm not a king's subject. I do not belong to you. The court, having considered this, then said, well, you know, if we apply English law to protect you, then surely you must come under our law. No, you know, law don't work like that. Law don't work like that at all. And so they said, this old man, then his lawyer got up, and this is documented. His lawyer got up and said, well, if this man is then classified as a British subject, then he is entitled to be paid compensation for the land that we've taken from him. That was 1821. And that's where they first came up with the concept of terra nullius, because they said we were not civilised enough to understand the polity and to understand a legal system of the English. And so there's a case sitting there. Then there were two others later, in the 1830s and 1840s, all saying the same thing. Now, then we come to Mabo. Mabo completely ignored those three cases, never said anything about them. But Mabo said and concluded that we and our rights as a people, our proprietary rights in land, our real estate interests in land survived British sovereignty. That's what gave us native title. They created native title. They also said, in that case, they looked at how in the world did they acquire paramount power over us. And you see, there's only three ways in which you can acquire land and territory and jurisdiction. One is that the people cede it to you, give it to you, and say, here, we'll obey everything you have. Or two, they declare war and they beat us and they conquer us by a legitimate war, having declared. Then we go into negotiations for a peace settlement, a peace accord. And then we agree that, okay, this is how the world is going to be hereafter. But you see, until that's done, the rule of war and law is that the laws of the ancient kingdom remains in place until they alter it through an agreement. That's the law of England, that's the law of Australia. And the third way is that no one was here. Well, terra nullius threw that out the door, the High Court threw that out the door. But the High Court then turned around and did a very nasty thing, which nobody takes notice of. But at least I don't think so. Not enough, anyway. They turned around and they said, well, this country was occupied. It was done by way of occupation. And having settled by occupation, they occupied it on the basis of a conquered nation, of a conquered people. That's in that High Court case. That's in that decision. So, with that being the conclusion, and part of the conclusion in that court case, then that opened up Pandora's box. Because you see, if we're conquered people, well, the laws of the ancient kingdom remains until they negotiate it away. Now, the white fella know how to manipulate it. I'll just finish on this. The white fella knows how to manipulate this. He said that we accept it as a conquered country based on the settlement principle. No, they're very smart, because then they wrote up a Native Title Act and said that we had the right under our law and custom to claim the land back under our law and custom, because the High Court now recognises our law and custom, and common law of Australia recognises that. So for us to claim land, we have to establish our connection through our law and custom. Now, what they're doing, though, is that they're not telling the truth, and they train them white lawyers to tell blackfellas lies and to cheat you. And the way they do that is they tell you, well, that's all gone now, you know, you can't use that there, and, you know, here, sign an Indigenous land use agreement. The Indigenous land use agreement is you giving your country away. That's what that is. You giving your country away for nothing. Yeah. Now, there's one other problem, and I will conclude on this. There's two, sorry. One. The first one is, under native title, they say, oh, see that farm there? We're going to mine that farm, that area. Yeah. And that's been a freehold lease or a perpetual pastoral lease, in the name of a whitefellow. Now, your native title rights and interests were extinguished. Bullshit. You see, that white man who has that deed and title, all he has is the right to farm that land down to about 12 inches of land. That's all that gives that white man. That white man only has a land use agreement himself with that title. And here's his problem. Under our law and culture, every tree, every grass, every plant that's native to that land, every kangaroo, every snake, every lizard, every little insect that grows on that land belongs to our law. Our law. Now, that white man might have the title, but read your state legislation, which tells you that the Queen of England owns the plants, trees and animals. So, under our law, I am a porcupine red kangaroo. That's my blood, that's me. So, if you're going to interfere with my country, and you're going to interfere with grasses that my kangaroo going to eat on, or my porcupine going to eat them ant, and you're going to disturb that ecosystem, then you're interfering with my law. You're interfering with my people, my ancestors, my connection, my family. You can't touch that unless you talk to me and get my permission to clear that land, and I don't care whether you got fee simple land title or not. You have to get my permission to clear that tree, to clear that grass. That's proper law. That's proper recognition of Aboriginal law. Now, when we look at that and we see how these whitefellas are cheating us big time, you see those plants and animals are worth more than that money you're going to get out of the ground, because they'd pay you for every plant, every tree. You know, it could be bush medicine, taka, spiritual use, all them things. You give a value to them. We have a value on all those things, cultural value. When we get a cultural value on things, we can also put an economic value on it as well, the same way a white man does. Play the white man at his game, because he will not beat us using our law. And unfortunately, his law now recognises our law. And our law don't belong to his law, they just recognise it. And until we learn as a people to understand how to fight that fight, the white man will keep walking over top of us. But we fight him under our law, he's got no chance. He's got no chance, because he's written a legislation that works in our favour if we're smart. But you see, we rely too much on a white man to tell us whether we're right or wrong. And this is our mistake. And under international law, I just conclude by saying this here, please, everyone, when you go home tonight, read the 2005 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Act. Have a look in the preamble. And here you will see where the Australian government in 2005 imported international law into Australian law that relates to the rights that we are fighting for. And so our rights are now governed by international law, and not enough blackfellas know it. And stop talking to them white lawyers who keep telling you lies, because these fellows are looking after their job. If you know anything about the Crown, and I won't go into conspiracy theories now, but if you know anything about the Crown, when them white lawyers swear an allegiance to the bar, they buggered, because their hands are tied. And there's not many brave white lawyers in this country, I tell you, because they're all looking for a feed just like us. Yeah? They have to pay their mortgage, they have to pay their motor car, they have to maintain a life standard that they studied for. Yeah? So beware of a white man coming with a black suit. Yeah? Thank you.
Brothers and sisters, in Stephen Goldsmith's language and the sound of that didge, he asks us to hear the spirit of Kaurna country, and every speaker before me has used that language. It is a rolling thunder across this land that does unite us and asks us at this hour, a very dangerous hour for the first people of this country, to take action. Think deeply. Spend a lot of quiet time working out what you can do. And don't leave here tonight without taking action to stop the relentless oppression that seeks to disrupt that harmony and that connection to country. In that welcome is the recipe for the well-being of us all from wherever we came and however long we've been here. Because all of those languages spoken tonight, the beauty of that rich diversity is the human story. And here we've got in this island the world's strongest, most resilient, and in my view, among the most beautiful expression of the human story, the intellect of the human being, of family and community. This is custodianship. In the view of the first people, it is not only physical, it is deeply intellectual and magnificently spiritual, because it binds us, as every speaker has expressed, to all of those living things that become the totems for us to relate to the echidna, to the koala, the kangaroo. When we gathered at the old telegraph station, an old man came and led me away from the talk fest for a while and said, "Little brother, come and meet the old man." And it was an old red roo, gnarled and sitting down in the creek bed on Alison and Rosalie's wonderful red dirt country. And we just sat there quietly looking at that old roo in the eye. So when you feel that connectedness, you are actually taking up earth science, as good as anything written in a book, as necessary for the survival of our humanity, as anything being put forward and shared with us from the world's finest scientists. So what is at stake when custodianship is threatened is the future of a genuine human family, a global human family, because I believe in that Aboriginal diversity, the multilingualism and the multiculturalism that has been here for longer than anyone really knows, is the recipe for human survival and human greatness. And we should not be timid in seeing that here in this country we are closer to greatness than anywhere I've been in over 60 years of world wandering. It is there within reach if we are not afraid to change and fix and heal the things that are broken. I want to add just 2 thoughts to support what my sisters and brother have so far said tonight. We ask you, with the title of this gathering, to think about what it is to be in the shoes of an Aboriginal man or woman or child. And if you put yourself in the shoes of a little boy or girl who was born in the Northern Territory in 2007, the first thing that you will feel is, for the first 15 years of your life, you are living in an occupied territory. That child will ask, why are they doing this to me? And the parents, uncles and aunties and grandparents will say, why are they still doing this to us? And it is what they ask this old man, when so often I may be one of the oldest fellas walking those red dirt streets in the remote communities I know and love. They ask, why are they still doing this to us? Or, as Rosalie said to me one night, as we drove thousands of Ks when she was running for the Senate back in the last federal election, she said, my brother, do you, with that greying hair, really think it is getting any better? Why are they still doing this to us? And I couldn't say truthfully that it is getting better. And we talked about that through all the years and miles that we have shared. And I want you, in the shoes of that child, to think, why is this happening? And my view is this. There is one very old strand. It's like the poison that Alison and Rosalie were talking about. Assimilation is like an arsenic. It is out there in this river system of political poison because it is constantly asking every Aboriginal person in this country to change. That is an old approach. It is in every major government policy directed, aimed at Aboriginal people. But what is new is the virulence and the cunning in the way this poison is being applied. In the 21st century, the assimilation is just as relentless as in the last 2 centuries, but there is something very aggressive, oh so hungry, and why it is poisoning the country under the very feet of whole communities is it is a ravenous appetite, this neoliberal project that does not truly care about most Australian people. It is a system that distributes wealth, all right, but not to the people. It goes to the capital managers. And I've watched it across the world. I could be in an African war zone like Liberia and see while the people are in conflict, half the country is bought up from underneath them. The Northern Territory intervention with that shock and awe was a magnificent distraction for what Alison mentioned. Overlay the map of the occupation and you will see what the neoliberal experiment is really after. The truth is, most of the mining that's happened so far in Australia is not on currently controlled Aboriginal land, but the El Dorado, the next phase, the easier access mineral wealth is all largely on Aboriginal controlled land. So you have about 420 or 30 mines today, probably only 20 or 30 of those have gone through the process of doing the deals. It should be fairly obvious why control of land and socially engineering people off-country into town, into the urban areas, accesses the easier attained mineral wealth, pastoral wealth, development of many kinds, ports, fisheries, it is still the wealth of this country that traditionally people lived in balance with to nurture all who were here. That is the goal of the neoliberal project. It is not going to benefit the majority of Australians if we persist with this destructive approach, because this development is not human development. I can't say I've been to a single mining community in Australia where outside on its doorstep the Aboriginal people have in fact benefited in well-being in any measurable way. The Prime Minister himself almost apologetically had to say in his last Close the Gaps report that it was deeply disappointing. So there is something quite contradictory in the approach. On the one hand, there is all this faux concern about that child in the remote community. There is a mock concern and moral lecturing about Aboriginal families taking care of that child. And yet the policy itself undermines the well-being of all of those children and families. It breaks the ability of mothers, fathers and extended families to even actually have the responsibility for their children. So it is no surprise that measurably those children are in as great a danger today as they were during the worst decades of the earlier stolen generations. It is why more of those young people will end up in jail. It is why we have a terrifying suicide contagion, a youthful suicide, when the well-being of this country as a whole is among the most magnificent of anywhere on earth. So, with all of that glowing good news, it is now coming as a deeply disturbing news report to the rest of the world to see how the oppression in our own backyard truly jeopardises the future of that child. Put yourself in the shoes of one of those children and you must feel you are living in a fourth world, in a parallel universe, because nothing that is coming out of the mouths of politicians makes any sense to that child. Here in South Australia, in Western Australia, in the Northern Territory, it is a very fragile existence for people in the homelands. Yes, belatedly, the federal government trickled a little more money here to South Australians, but that is not genuine sustenance for those communities. The truth is, all of those families in South Australia have a human right, an entitlement, simply by being human, not only for being first people on their country, but this shameful game of shuffling the responsibility for the homelands to some other servicing department misses the real truth that there is not one of those homelands that gets the same service that you or I would demand for my wife, my children, and my community. And that is why we must act. Find a way yourself to make this personal if you're going to walk in the shoes of those children. I went to meet the UN Special Rapporteur for Social and Cultural Policy, Dr. Farida Shahid. And she was most interested to learn that in the homelands in Western Australia, many Aboriginal people already cannot access sacred sites that they consider essential for their spiritual well-being. She was deeply disturbed to be informed that, in fact, moving people off the remote homelands would in fact break their continuous occupation of those traditional lands, which you all know is a key facet of the High Court's insistence on whether they can even someday make a native title on land. But importantly, Dr. Shahid was interested in the threat to the rupturing of the cultural relationship to country. Michael touched on the truth. It is in our domestic law now. All of those international importations of the covenants we said as a nation we were going to support are there in domestic law. Our federal, state and territory governments are ignoring our own whitefella law because there is no legal right to trample the relationship of people to country. If we ignore that and turn away, as we have for most of the 2 centuries, there will be no closing of that space between us. All of the statistical goals, which are almost meaningless to that child that we're focusing on, will not improve. The truth is, that child today may as well be born with the tombstone epitaph already chiselled. We owe every one of our children the well-being that is the natural endowment of this most beautiful land. We are a human family. Our greatness as a human society will be when we see through the shallowness of the current fixation on a certain kind of development that does not benefit the society at large, and we recognise that in the most ancient, highly intelligent value of custodianship for all life here, we have earth science. We have a creed for unity. We have a value system that surely left, right and every other political shade could embrace. That is the way to find common ground. I am not attracted to the distractions that ignore the truth. This is Aboriginal country. We come to be part of that. And when we feel it and celebrate it and sing it, like Stephen's Ditch, then we are part of the beauty. And then nothing will hold this country back. That's the day that I live for. Thank you.
I'd like to pay my respects to the Kaurna country that I stand on. Thank you for welcoming me here. I'd like to pay my respects to everybody in this room, all in one hit, because you're all equal to each other. You know, we live our days under the sun, no less equal, no more than who we are. I'd like to make special mention to Toto. He's just a great human being. I don't think there's much more than I can add than what has been said here tonight by that wealth of knowledge, by that lived experience of 3, 4 and 5 decades. But I'll note 3 different nutshells in the minutes that I've got at hand. The last 5 or 6 years, I've been a volunteer correspondent with the National Indigenous Times and the National Indigenous Radio Service. This came about because I was asked, because of my many travels, 7, 8, 9 months of the year, to the homelands, to communities right across this continent. I've probably been to more communities, homelands than what most people have. In Western Australia, if there are 282 communities, I've been to more than 100 of them. I've been to hundreds across the country. The more west we journey across this continent, the worse the hits on our First People, the more racist it gets. The statistical narrative speaks to that. I'm a researcher. I've spent my life in academic circles, but I've had enough of research. I've had enough of reports. Just as there's an industry of carpetbaggers lining, as Alison said, 22,000 bureaucrats in the Northern Territory. We'll take that into context. 22,000, the Northern Territory population's 250,000, 160,000 non-Aboriginal. That means 1 in 7 to 1 in 8 of all the non-Aboriginal population is a bureaucrat, servicing the needs of 1 in 4 of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander populations of the Northern Territory, the First Peoples. And I'll put it to you that an adult male living today in the Northern Territory, their life expectancy is still 52 years, 52 years. Now, the more west we travel across this continent, the worse all the statistics. And the statistical narrative is important. We do have to disaggregate. In this state, South Australia, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, First People, are incarcerated at 2,400 per 100,000 population. You may not understand the numbers, but that's dramatic because our Australian prison population is comprised of a rate, nationally, the trend of 150 per 100,000. But yet we incarcerate our First Peoples in this state at 2,400 per 100,000. That rises in the Northern Territory to 2,800. And in Western Australia, where I'm from, that rises to 3,700 per 100,000. 1 in 13 of all Aboriginal adult males in Western Australia is in prison today. 1 in 13. From a racialised lens, that is the highest jailing rate in the world. 8% of the Aboriginal adult male population, 8%, is in prison today in that state, in Western Australia. So we've got to see things from a racialised lens. This is, as Jeff alluded to, a great country in terms of public health. It is ranked second in the world, behind Norway. It is the 12th largest economy, second wealthiest nation per capita, highest median wages. Highest median wages in the world regionally are Western Australia, then the Northern Territory. Yet those two states, that state and territory, have the worst statistical narrative for our First Peoples. From a racialised lens, the worst in the world. The Kimberley, where I visit 2 or 3 months of the year, where most of our homelands are, the highest concentration, 46% of the population First Peoples. The Kimberley has a homeless rate, one of the highest in the world, yet it doesn't get a mention in mainstream media. 7% of the whole of the Kimberley is homeless, in one form of homelessness or another. 7% homeless, outside natural disasters and civil strife. That is one of the world's worst homeless rates. Doesn't get much worse. I don't hold out the hope that everybody else holds out from what I've seen, but I fight the battle. I sit on government boards in mental health and suicide prevention. I'm part of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander suicide prevention projects. I work with Pat Dudgeon, Professor Pat Dudgeon, who many of you would know, because we want to make a difference. But you've got to be who you are 24/7. You can't be who you should be part of the time. Whether it's at the government level, or whether it's at the coalface or in academia or wherever, you've got to stand up and tell the story as it is. We weren't put on this earth to betray one another, but we do. We weren't put on this earth to bury our children, but we do. If we're going to make a difference, we have to do the difference as the lived experience, day in, day out. Say it as it is, wherever it may be. And this is one reason I undertook the extra work, not that I don't have enough on my plate, of writing for the National Indigenous Times for 5 or 6 years, 15, 16 stories a week, because that's the narrative that's actually out there that's untold. For all the stories I wrote, for all the voices I wrote out from the homelands, the communities from around the country, there were scores I couldn't. There were scores that broke my heart because the tragedy is huge, but it was an opportunity for the psychosocial, for healing, for venting, for saying your piece. It all helps. And it adds to the story, and sometimes we cultivate difference, and we can work with other good people, whether it's in the media, whether it's in government, to make a difference. But I used also the National Indigenous Times to write 200 articles on suicide, the suicide crisis, to cultivate that into the national media and the mainstream, and to leverage change from government in responses. And yes, despite what's actually happening at the forefront, behind the scenes, we are doing many things, but we've got a long journey, and it's still piecemeal. We all have to step up to the plate. We all have to step up and get feet on the ground. Feet on the ground, whether it's at the rallies, whether it's in forums, take these forums across the country, replicate them, live stream them, take them out. We've got to go for a cultural shift. Without that cultural shift, our days under the sun are misspent. Our meaning is diminished in who we are and who we should be to one another. It's why I've stood alongside my Aboriginal brothers and sisters for 3.5 decades, because my father, as a young person, as a migrant, once said to me, the racism that we were born into, the racism that you are born into, my son, that you feel day in, day out because of the colour of your skin in this country, because of the way we come across, it pales into insignificance to that of our brothers and sisters, our First Peoples. Until we get it right for them, or they are allowed to get it right in the ways it should be, we have got it right for no one in this country, for no one. It can't be that the Kimberley has the highest suicide rate in the world from a racialised lens of our Aboriginal brothers and sisters, but it is. It is in this 12th largest economy on the planet, second wealthiest nation per capita. The far north Queensland in a similar position, the world's highest suicide rates from a racialised lens. 4 years ago, I wrote a story in the National Indigenous Times. It came from my government insiders, from the ministers I mix it with. They spoke to me about 180 communities, homelands in Western Australia, that there was a list for them to be closed, to amalgamate them into larger towns, or to rid them off the country, that the First Peoples of the Western Desert, of the Gascoyne, of the Murchison, of parts of the Kimberley, of the Pilbara, to rid them off that country, to make it easier for the miners, the developers, the commercial interests, the neoliberal project that Jeff was referring to. I broke that story 4.5 years ago in the National Indigenous Times, but it didn't rate much of a mention. It was fobbed off. The government said there is no such list. There is no such list. And that your sources and insiders are conspiratorial and fanciful. I knew there was a list, and I pursued that story and kept on going on with it and kept on trying to cultivate the media to carry it out. Late last year, that story flared up again because of a municipal bill, but that's sleight of hand. That is what it was never about. I'll put it this way. Our federal government, our Commonwealth, has long held an agenda of assimilation. But as I said a little bit earlier, the more west we go across this country, the worse it gets for our First Peoples. Western Australia is a very insular place. Mining is this whole bit. For them, it's not about assimilation. Assimilation is a tool for exploitation. What they want to do is clear the vast interior and the top end for the miners, the developers, the commercial interests. They want people off-country to tap into that ore, the minerals, and also the uranium that's there. There are now 4 sites slated for uranium mining in Western Australia: Yillaree, Wiluna, Kintyre and Mulga Rock, most of it on Martu country. For them, it is controversial to have people on country near uranium mines and the sickness that will come with it, because nowhere are the baseline levels of radiation ever kept to what they should be wherever there is uranium mining. They know that the future of Western Australia is 30 uranium mines to feed an industry that is fast coming. We have 400 nuclear reactors around the world, 200 more on their way. By 2100 it is estimated that we will have 1,000. Australia is already into deals with the rest of the world to export high-grade uranium, and 40% of the world's accessible higher-grade uranium is in Western Australia, and then there's also the Northern Territory. This is what it's actually all about, and this is a story that's not being carried out by the mainstream media. It is not about what has been said, a municipal bill. That's rubbish. That's pittance what that whole thing was about. $90 million annual to run 282 communities, homelands, and in South Australia, $10 million annual for 100 communities. That's pittance, that's nothing. The language we must stick to is not one of consultation. We've got to be careful not to transition into language that we must be consulted about our communities, our homelands. Who closes down someone's place of origin? Who closes down someone's homeland, where someone came from? Yes, there is natural attrition, and places are not what they once were, but let that be in that manner and way, natural attrition, and let these homelands remain so people can go back to their place of origin or children and grandchildren to where their heritage is from. Why should that be denied to them in 2015 or in 2020 or 2030 or 2050? That should never be the case. The waves of migrants that came to this country do go back to their villages and their towns. However, whether there are services there or not, that's natural attrition, but those villages, towns, their buildings, their homes are there. How can we go raising the homelands? Bulgari, 62 houses. 62 houses were raised in November. And it is not just in Bulgari. It's been going on for a long time. Kanana, outside of Kalgoorlie, it has been starved of services for years. The people are living under corrugated iron in shanty towns at Ningamaya, outside Kalgoorlie. Port Hedland is surrounded by shanty towns and tent cities. And I mention Port Hedland because it's the busiest port in Australia for the mining boom, Native title is not the answer either. 340 federal court determinations, 1,000 ILUAs, and as Jeff said, I have not seen any community holistically benefit. There are communities that bring in tens and hundreds of millions of dollars from native title, and they represent 1,500, 2,000 people, yet they live impoverished. They live impoverished. The Matu have not benefited. The Gumala have not benefited. The Yinjabandi have not benefited. It's the same story right across the country. The story that we're not chasing is one about social health. It is one about racialisation and racism. The homelands may be poor and may be impoverished, many of them. That is not of their making. That is not of their making. It is governments for 20, 30, 40 years who have degraded these communities, who have denied them the equivalency of services, infrastructure and opportunity, social health, equivalent to the non-Aboriginal communities, to what Jeff said and others have said that we all enjoy. We have degraded these communities. Jigalong begged for 15 years for clean water. 15 years for clean water, yet it is right near the mining towns, the mining boom. In Western Australia, the majority of the homelands have had to beg for the upgrade and upkeep of their water tanks, for pipelines, for power lines, and many of them have been rejected these. That is degradation, and that is degradation from a racialised perspective. That is racism. Until we actually get up and say what the actual issue is, one of social health, one of opportunity, one of equal access, one of addressing the inequalities, we will never reach solutions. We will never get to outcomes. We will continue to betray one another in our days under the sun. We will continue to bury our children. And for me, who works in suicide, who works in trying to prevent it, who works at the coalface and at the government level, it breaks my heart to bury an 11-year-old, to bury a 12-year-old, to bury a 13-year-old, to bury a 14-year-old, to bury a 15-year-old, to bury a 16-year-old, to bury a 17-year-old, to bury an 18-year-old, because each of those ages, I have been to a funeral where we have buried someone who should have gone on to do much more in life, The solutions are equality. The solutions are the call for it. The solutions are to step up. The solutions are to speak out. The solutions are to believe that we can make that difference from whatever level or from wherever we are in whatever way we can, because it'll happen no how else. And if we don't do that, things will just get worse. As I said, 1 in 13 of all our Aboriginal and adult males in Western Australia are in prison. It's going to get worse. It's going to get worse. The trends have shown that year in, year out. I've had enough of research. I've had enough of reports. I've packed them all away and I work at the coalface, and I've been trying to push that there is no greater legacy that we can have than to improve the lot of others to the point that we save lives. In the Kimberley, 1 in every 3 of our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander males of our First People will be dead by the age of 45. Unnatural, premature deaths and suicides. Suicide is so dramatic in the taking of life in this country, in this high-income, socially wealthy, powerfully public health nation, that it officially takes 1 in 20 of every Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders. Suicide takes 1 in 20. My research says 1 in 10. 1 in 10. Once again, that is the world's most horrific rate from a racialised lens. Look, I'll wrap it up with this. We can win this. We can win this. I'm not a believer in rallies around the clock, but I am a believer in standing up, in feet on the ground. But what I do believe in is in sustaining the coverage, in chasing down the justice. The rallies that have lifted the nation's spirits and the spirits of the people in the homelands, yes, they are of an immense value. Yes, tens of thousands have come out. We need to keep that going. What we did in March 19, what we did again on May 1, we will be doing again in June with another suite of rallies. We've gone from 30 rallies around the country and the world to 85 at the last count. We'll go to 150 at the next one. People are coming together and at the fore. But the homelands are not protected. The agenda is still there, and it is always one of attrition of how to betray your fellow person, your fellow human being. And we do need to keep up and at it, and we do need to come together in numbers and in any other innovative way that will come to mind. And we do need to make a difference, because in the end, who depends on it? We as human beings, each and every one of us. We're all under this earth, under the one sun, and we need to fight this battle together to the end of days or to our last breath. Much respect.
Thank you very much, Jerry. And that's one of the reasons why I call the forum, ladies and gentlemen. I'm 65, going on 66, but I feel something great is coming to us. I feel I'm going to see something great before I die. And I think I will. With people like this on my right, and with people like you in the front of me, I can see change in Aboriginal affairs. I can see a movement that's going to make people stand up and listen and take notice. I take note of what Jerry said is, we don't want consultation, we want negotiations about how we live in our own country. And negotiations are the great outcome. There's a saying that if they come for them today, they'll come for us tomorrow. And that's what's happening. They're heading our way. They're all going through the Western Australia now. They've gone through the Northern Territory, and they're heading into South Australia. And we've got to be smarter, and we've got to stand up and support one another. And it doesn't matter if an Aboriginal or a non-Aboriginal is standing next to you, long as they're standing for a greater outcome, and that's the outcome for us.